Welcome back to the London Futurist podcast. The public discussion in a number of countries around the world expresses worries about what is called an ageing society. These countries anticipate a future with fewer younger people who are active members of the economy and a growing number of older people who need to be supported by the people still in the workforce. It's an inversion of the usual demographic pyramid, with less at the bottom and more at the top. However, our guest in this episode recommends a different framing of the future, not as an aging society, but as a longevity society, or even an evergreen society. He is Andrew Scott, Professor of Economics at the London Business School. His other roles include being a research fellow at the Centre for Economic Policy Research and a consulting scholar at Stanford University's Centre on Longevity. Andrew's latest book is entitled The Longevity Imperative: Building a Better Society for Healthier, Longer Lives. Commendations for the book include this from the political economist Darren Acemoglu, a must-read book with an important message and many lessons. And this from the historian Niall Ferguson, persuasive, uplifting, and wise. From my own reading of The Longevity Imperative, I fully concur with these opinions. Andrew, welcome to the London Futurist podcast.
Thank you, David and Callum. Great to be back.
Thanks for rejoining us, Andrew.
Andrew, let's start with this notion of an evergreen society. What do you mean by that?
One of the reasons I wrote the book is I hear a great deal about AI and climate change as key determinants of our future, which is obviously right. And I hear really engaged discussions about how we adapt and adjust. But we don't hear much about what I call longevity. We hear instead a lot about an aging society. And whereas AI and climate change get people interested and a sense of urgency, no one seems to get excited about an aging society. No one says, yeah, great, we got an aging society. It's a remarkable way of looking at one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century, these extraordinary gains in life expectancy. I think it's a real problem because we interpret an aging society as being a change in the age structure of the population. Fewer younger people, more old people. And that's always seen as a negative. And I get that there are challenges in seeing an increase in the average age of society. But I think it's to focus on the least interesting aspect of what has happened. Because I think, although there is undoubtedly a change in the age structure, although it's remarkable that for the first time ever in human history, there are more people aged 65 than under 5, I think something more fundamental has happened, which is that we can now expect the young and the middle-aged to become old. For most of human history, getting old was a minority occupation. Reaching 80 or 90 was something that 5 to 10% of people did. Now, if you look at the government projections of life expectancy, which are pretty conservative, we've got over 50% living into their high 80s, early 90s. And I think that creates a new imperative, a longevity imperative. We now are likely to become old. We fear getting old. We fear outliving health, wealth, finances, etc. So we have to change how we age. We have to do things differently at every age to ensure that we age well. We've already achieved long lives. We've got to make them healthier for longer, productive and engaged for longer. And that's partly about geroscience, but it's about so many other things. And so we need a society that focuses on helping us to age well. That's never been a priority before because it's a minority occupation in the past. Now it's not. And I think it's a fundamentally different moment. We've achieved a first longevity revolution. The young can expect to become old. Now we need a second one, which is changing how we age. That's what I mean by an evergreen society. We have to remain evergreen. We have to remain fit for all seasons. We have to make sure that we have our health, our finances, our relationships, and a sense of purpose.
There are many encouraging statistics in your books, such as the most likely age for the people to die is nowadays very considerably higher than it was back in the 1950s. And another one, which is that at any given age, the likelihood of various diseases such as dementia is less now than it was in the past. Does that mean, in your view, that society is already on track to become an evergreen one?
I guess I agree with that. It's a generous, I would say, really. I mean, it depends how long the track is and how direct the track is. We're taking a pretty meandering route and we're at the early stages of it. We know that we've slowed down the dying process, so people are living for longer. We haven't done a great job of slowing down the aging process. So although there are some improvements, and you mentioned dementia, and what we're seeing there is that although we're living longer, so your lifetime risk of dementia is increasing, the evidence points to the fact that at every age, you're now less likely than previously to get dementia. So there are definitely some improvements. We've made some changes in how we age, but they're pretty small. We're really seeing life expectancy outstrip healthy life expectancy, which is then creating this longevity imperative. The gap between health span and lifespan is set to get larger because we have a health system that's good at keeping us alive, not great at keeping us healthier for longer.
I think I'm right in saying that there has recently been a pause in at least some of the developed economies in the growth of longevity, particularly in America. It actually went backwards for a while. Is there any evidence that that pause is now over, or have we got a bit more to go?
US life expectancy trends are very different from elsewhere. So there's a concept, best practice life expectancy, which country has the highest life expectancy, as Japan. And that's up to about 87 now. Japanese women can expect to live to 87. And the gap between US life expectancy and best practice continues to widen, as it does in the UK. So that's a problem. The reason, there are lots of reasons for it. I think the main reason is one of growing inequality in the United States. So if you're at the top end of the income distribution, your life expectancy is still increasing. But there's this midlife crisis, these deaths of despair. And they're so large, they're dragging down the average. But what's interesting is life expectancy at 65 has still been rising because a lot of those deaths of despair have been at younger ages. Plus, there's all sorts of problems to do with COVID, which, given the way life expectancy is calculated, have a temporary impact and tend not to be a permanent one. But I do think we will see life expectancy trends slow down. But it would be a mistake to think that means longevity is not very important, because the way life expectancy is calculated is effectively the probability of getting from 0 to 60 now in Japan is pretty close to 1. It's like 97%. So you can't get much further improvements in life expectancy going from 0 to 60. So all the life expectancy gains now tend to be coming increasingly after the age of 60 or 70. And so there's just fewer ages to make a contribution. But of course, those life expectancy gains now are all about longevity. It's not about your chance of getting to middle age. It's now all about living for longer. So though we are seeing life expectancy growth slow down, I would say it's getting more and more about what I would call longevity.
You have a lot in your book about history, which I found fascinating. You mention a bit about the Reverend Thomas Malthus, who was a previous writer on the economics of lives and deaths. And he, in 1798, famously predicted a rather bleak future involving lots of deaths. I guess we got the advantage of hindsight here. What did Malthus fail to foresee, and how is that relevant to your own vision on the future of aging?
Well, I'm glad you like the history, because I was very keen to ground where we are now into longer term trends, because I do think we're entering a new period. Sometimes we can approach longevity through the lens of science fiction, but I think it's quite nice to approach it through the lens of history, to see it as an inflection point, but also as a continuation. So Malthus was a political economist in those days. That was what you called economists. And economics is known as the dismal science, but my goodness, Malthus was dismal. So 1798, Malthus said basically there's a limit to the world's population. Effectively, his point was population grows exponentially, whereas our ability to create resources grows linearly. So population will always outstrip our ability to provide resources. It kind of went to town as to what the consequences would be, because you'd have famine, you'd have disease, you'd have wars. All these things would be required to keep the population in check. Now, when he was writing, the world population was around about 1 billion. Last year, it reached 8 billion. Malthus always said there's a limit to the world population. He was smart enough not to give any numbers or any dates as to what the limit was and when it would be reached. But it seems pretty obvious to me that he was surprised by what happened. We're seeing some challenges right now around sustainability in the world's population. But the point I think is interesting is that he said we couldn't support a large population. We couldn't create the resources. What I think he failed to anticipate was effectively the Industrial Revolution. With the Industrial Revolution, we did investment. We created new institutions. We came up with new inventions. We basically utilized human ingenuity and made each person more productive, which meant we could support a larger population. And we became so much more productive that we could put more resources into health and education that made us even more productive. And why I think that's an interesting lesson is there's a sort of negativity around the aging society, which reminds me of Malthus. Whereas Malthus was saying, hey, the population will outstrip the resources we've got. An aging society story says, hey, we're living too long. Our length of life is outstripping our resources. And the consequence is going to be pretty miserable. We're going to get illness. We're going to have poverty. Pensions go bust, etc. And I think we've got to think, well, why was Malthus's projection wrong? How do we respond from a longevity angle? How do we do the investment, create the new institutions, have the new inventions, basically use our human ingenuity to say, you know what, we can support a life that goes on to 90 or 100. We just got to be healthier, engaged and productive for longer. We've never bothered doing that before because only a few people became old. Now it's incredibly important to do it. So it's a change of mindset. The aging society story is bleak, negative, and assumes there's nothing we can do, and it's all about a change in the age structure of the population. Whereas we've just got to change how we age. And I say just, it's obviously a pretty fundamental change, but that's what we have to do.
One of the big things that Malthus missed was the enormous increase in productivity of agriculture. You mentioned the Industrial Revolution. In fact, the Industrial Revolution kind of wrapped up inside itself a second agricultural revolution.
Yeah.
I guess we probably need another one. If we do have a spurt of longevity, perhaps the end of using so much land to grow animals to feed ourselves is going to be a big part of that. So plant-based meat, lab-grown meat, vertical farming, are these all parts of the evergreen society as you see it?
Well, they could be. They're certainly evergreen in a different way, aren't they? I think there could be great health advantages in that. Also, tackling the environment is going to be not just right in its own sense, but it's going to be one of the biggest health challenges we face. So I agree on that. So I think there's a synergy between them. You also had another issue, which is around productivity, which is if we're living a longer life, we do have to be more productive over our lifetime if we want to avoid seeing a fall in the standard of living. So then the question is, how do we achieve that? And we can either work for longer or be more productive when we do work. So it may be, AI is going to come along and make us more productive and help solve that problem. I still think you've then got another remaining problem, which is I'm living for longer. Even if I can finance it, I've got to be engaged for longer. So this is really about how we create the institutions that keep us engaged, curious, and active for the length of our life. Right now, certainly in the West, we're very under-institutionalized in that area.
As you pointed out, Malthus avoided giving some numbers. I'm going to try and put you on the spot. How do we measure the benefits of a longer life? You have this concept, well, it's not your concept, it's a general economics concept of the VSL, the value of a statistical life. And it ends up with some very large numbers indeed in terms of the benefits. Could you talk us through the gist of such a calculation?
Yes, I read the paper with Martin Urson and David Sinclair that came out in Nature Aging. And a lot of my work is about how we assess the economic value of longer lives and aging better. And as you say, the staggering numbers. There's sort of three ways to approach this as an economist. One is one that finance ministries and actually health systems are very keen that I do, which is say, hey, if we age better, we spend less money. So show me the ways I can reduce my money on care homes and knee replacements, hip replacements. I sort of get that. I have to say, I think that's a mistake because I think health is very valuable. Health, as we get richer, we spend a greater proportion of our money on health. And as we're living longer, I think we need to spend more money on health. We just got to spend it on good health outcomes rather than bad health outcomes. And, if we come up with a cure for dementia that costs twice what we currently spend on dementia, I'm all in. That'd be a fantastic use of money. So I'm a bit nervous about the cost save. I get it, and I play that game with ministries of finance, but I think it's a limited one. And I think it's a little bit dangerous path to go down if you're advocating longevity gains. The second one is what's the boost to the economy? And I'm working on that at the moment. Clearly, if we live for longer, perhaps we can work for longer, or we'll have to work for longer. But the body is a complicated subject, which is why biology of aging is so interesting. The economy is another very complicated system. And I would say we still haven't got a proper worked out model of if we live for longer and we're healthy for longer, what are all the channels at work? There's so many of them. How do you factor in education? How do you factor in the 1,001 other characteristics? But I'm doing some ongoing work on that. The other is to sort of utilize health tools. It's pretty standard in health systems to say, what is the economic value of this improvement in health? And that's not just about the boost of GDP. It's just like, what does it mean to me? So DALYs, for instance, disability adjusted life years, or QALYs, then attempt to say, what are the welfare gains for improving an illness? So that's what the value of statistical life does. It sort of says, look, if I can reduce your mortality risk by 1%, what's it worth? And there's a model underlying it which looks at people's behavior, when they work, how much they save, the quality of life in terms of health. And you can use this model to say, look, if you make this intervention, people are healthier for longer, they live for longer, this is the value of a statistical life. And you can look at the difference between two scenarios to say, this is the welfare gains that come from it. If, for instance, you go and you buy a car and you're prepared to spend £1,000 for airbags, and that reduces your mortality risk by 1%, then 100 times 1,000 would be the value of your statistical life. It's $100,000. The US government uses this tool to evaluate various implemented safety measures. You can use it in health as well. The good news is the value of statistical life is very high in America. It's like $11.5 million or something. And if you think about the average lifetime earnings of someone, that's way more than they're going to earn. So what this says is that life is valuable itself. We don't just think of life in terms of how much income we're going to earn. There's something over and above that, which is just the quality of life. So that's what we did in the modeling exercise. We used these standard economic tools to say, well, let's think about the value of aging well. What we found was a bunch of things. The first is living longer is valuable, because we do value living longer, more time. But if you're living in diminishing health, it gets ever less valuable. The second thing was that getting health span to catch up with lifespan is just phenomenally valuable. It is the biggest health improvement we've got. But of course, if you could slow down the biological rate of aging, you live for longer and you're in better health, which gives you two benefits, but those two interact to give you an even larger benefit. So the gains are huge. And we calculated for the US that if you could slow down aging biologically, such that you had an extra year of life, but also in better health, that's worth $37 trillion in present value. Now, it's a staggering number, and it's worth trying to explain how you get to that number. It's basically 3 to 4% of GDP every year. If you then add that up over the future and discount, you get this very big number. What's interesting about the study, if you look at what we did with COVID, we shuttered the economy, we lowered GDP growth in order to save lives. And actually that 3% of GDP versus 1 year saved was roughly, I think, what we did with COVID. So it just says health is the most valuable thing to us. The most important health challenge is how we age. Therefore, if we could slow down aging, it is enormously valuable. So that's really what the paper does.
So you're working on the economic impacts of greater longevity. Of course, we have to make the greater longevity happen. And I know you work with longevity researchers. And as you say, human biology is fantastically complicated. It's no easy matter to increase longevity. Are there any particular projects, initiatives that you're especially excited about in the longevity research area? And which ones are you keeping a close eye on?
I claim agnosticism. I'm not a scientist. I'm really nervous about commenting on it. I find it all exciting, all exhilarating, if I can sort of say that way. It's a really, really exciting time. Not being a scientist, the way I model these things, I model various variables as a function of some latent variable called aging. There's loads of ways we can make aging malleable. There's loads and loads of ways that we can improve that trade-off between a whole bunch of measures and currently how we measure age, which is chronological. The GLP-1 drugs, for instance, is a really interesting example.
This tackles obesity.
Exactly.
This is the Wegovy drug and the other obesity reduction drugs, which have made Denmark into a company town for Novo Nordisk.
Exactly. I don't know the extent to which they're anything to do with the biology of aging, but they're going to be mimicking something that says, hey, I can change an underlying cause that affects multiple diseases. But what I think is interesting about that is that when I talk to people who aren't interested in longevity, or not in the way that you and I are, they have this disease model that you can just target one disease. I think what's so interesting about the obesity drugs is that here's a very simple biomarker people understand, obesity. It links into multiple diseases so that you're going to get a big gain because you aggregate across lots of diseases. And then because you remove several of them at the same time, you get this huge increase in the quality of life. So at least in terms of my modeling, that's absolutely isomorphic, identical to what would happen if you could slow down biological aging. Why that's interesting is it starts to sort of be the Trojan horse that gets people to say, oh yeah, okay, let's tackle the underlying causes. Now, I'm sure we can push it back much further than focusing on obesity, but I do think that's a really interesting innovation conceptually for getting the non-geroscience people to go, okay, I get this.
Beyond the scientific changes, you said there's a whole bunch of other things we could be doing as a society to allow people to age better, to have productivity for longer in their lives. So why aren't we doing these things?
Yeah, I sort of oscillate on this question. For the first time ever in human history, the young and middle age can expect to become old, and we've got to focus on changing how we age. That's going to require a bit of a mind change, isn't it? We just have never targeted aging and trying to think we need to make it malleable. I think it's only as we've got more and more older people, we're recognizing the scale of the issue, but also just how malleable aging is, like inequality in income. We know how to speed up aging. You look at people in the lower end of the income distribution, they age much more rapidly than those at the top. There's this stat that I and many others quote that I think it's this side of sort of 80 or 90, about 80% of how you age is based on your behavior and your environment. That's great news for those at the top of the income distribution, pretty bad news for those at the bottom. So we know that this age is malleable. We're beginning to discover it, but we just never had the incentive to do it. Again, we're really interested in the geroscience and the new biological breakthroughs. And I kind of look at that in two ways. The first is most of the advice that people give on podcasts about how to age well, it's pretty obvious stuff, isn't it? It's eat less, drink less, exercise more, sleep more. They've kind of been given a scientific makeover in terms of the precision of how to fast. But at its core, it's been a long-running knowledge. It's just what's changed our incentive to do it. Because now, when a 20-year-old can expect to become old, you've got to do it in a way that you didn't do before. So I think there's sort of this incentive shift. The other thing I think is interesting is, and I quote Medivar and Montaigne in the book, for most of human history, aging was considered, if you like, unnatural. It wasn't a natural way to die because smallpox would get you or a whole host of other diseases. But now we sort of think of aging as natural, as immutable. We draw a distinction between health and aging because we've been so successful at eliminating typhus and smallpox. And so I think there's a cultural mindset that still has to be tackled, which is, we can do something about aging. And I think it's going to take a very long time to shift that mindset. I think that's what it is, which is why people focus on a change in the age structure of the population, because if you can't change how you age, there's lots of information in the change in the age structure of the population. But if you can change how you age, then focusing on the change in the age structure of the population really isn't very useful. It doesn't tell you much about what's going to happen to the economy.
If it's not too personal a question, Andrew, what are you doing to maximize your own longevity? I'm sure you're getting lots of sleep and exercise and eating well, but are you taking melatonin or rapamycin, and have you signed up for any brain preservation services?
Well, I'm a professor, so do as I say, not what I do, of course. I'm always very nervous at this point because I don't have a scientific background, so I can understand the science, but I can't critically evaluate it. I also don't have the medical expertise to monitor my body and how it's responding to various treatments. I have it past dabble, but I currently don't take any supplements. Everyone I speak to is in the longevity subjects says that's crazy and they miss me and all those sorts of things. But I focus on the things that I understand and can do something about the best I possibly can. So I focus much more on sleep. I've cut out a lot of alcohol. I exercise a whole more. But one of the things I try to focus on in the book, which I think is really important, is I think we can see this subject technocratically. How do we value statistical life? How do we change retirement policies? We can see it scientifically as to what supplements we're taking. But ultimately, this is a human thing. It's kind of what do you do with that time? And I think what's really interesting about the negativity around aging is we've medicalized old age. So we see it only in terms of decline. And I think that's why we sort of get this rather bifurcated debate where you say, oh, aging society, it's terrible. Everyone's going to get dementia. Everyone's going to be in diapers. We can't change how we age. And then on the other side, it's like, what, you're going to make age malleable? I don't want to live forever. So there's this huge chasm in between, which it just says, well, we can just do better than we're currently doing, and we will carry on doing so. And I think that raises the question, well, why? What is the gains to living longer? And I think that's where you come up with, actually, some things increase with age. Lifetime satisfaction, it tends to be higher amongst older people. And the psychologists emphasize adult development. I didn't used to get the point when they would raise it. But going back to what I'm doing to try and age well, I think it is that sense of, oh, you've got to keep growing. You've got to keep learning. You've got to think, who am I? What do I like to do? And how do I shift and change? So that's very much, I would say, where I'm doubling down on.
Well, one thing you can do as an economist is recommend metrics for the evaluation of society as a whole.
Yeah.
And you say it's easy to measure people's age.
Yeah.
What is the right measurement for the healthiness of people's aging?
That's a great question, David, and something I'm super keen on. Let me call it healthy life expectancy, because there's a whole bunch of marketing issues around this and which agenda you're proposing, how do you get people to listen? But some good population-based measure of healthy life expectancy. Why I think that's important is that at the heart of all this, we've got these longer lives. How do we make them healthier for longer? With an aging society, health is absolutely crucial. And what staggers me as an economist is how little incentives there are in the system to deliver good health outcomes. Take the case of the United Kingdom, for instance. The NHS doesn't have a goal of healthy life expectancy. Its goals are to cut waiting lists, to increase the number of operations. So we've really got to allocate resources to try and improve health. And I think I would like also to see the state pension age be a function of some measure of healthy life expectancy. Because first of all, that's fair. You can't just keep working for longer just because you're living for longer and you're in bad health. But we need to make sure that the treasuries have an incentive to increase health. And right now they don't. They just see health as an expenditure. But if you can recognize that if I spend on health and people can work for longer and I make money as a treasury doing that, that's a game changer. So I do think measuring health and then making sure it's a target that feeds into the system is really crucial here.
Another piece of the puzzle is to get the general public to value longer lives. It always amazes me when I talk to people of my age, which is sort of around about retirement age, how few people I know are excited about the idea of living longer. They think that 80 years is plenty and they wouldn't want any more. Sometimes they think it's immoral to want more.
Yeah.
Sometimes they think that we'll overpopulate the world. But even just selfishly, they don't seem to want more life, which I just find staggering. And that has to change. I do think that when medical science forms a consensus that considerably longer lives are possible, I think that will lead to a change in attitudes. But I think it will be a bumpy change. I'm increasingly thinking that the first time that on the Oprah Winfrey show, people say, oh, yeah, we can all live for 20, 30 years longer, I think there'll be a short period in which people panic and think, that's awful. We need to figure out a way to get over that bump as quickly as possible. Have you had any thoughts about that?
Another great question. Part of that, I think, if I go back to my first longevity revolution, which is getting the majority to live a long life, and then a second longevity revolution, which is changing how we age. Changing how we age is a big cultural mindset. And because we haven't got the institutions to support a longevity society, I get why people are afraid. I call it the longevity imperative. We are now likely to get old, but that's going beyond our institutions to support us being healthy, productive, and engaged. So I think part of the problem is the aging society story is so dominant that we think that everyone becomes ill when they get old, and we've forgotten that not everyone does. There's a real fear and a lower tail problem. But secondly, I think unless we change society, we are right to worry about it. And if we did overnight suddenly add 20 to 30 years to life expectancy, our social institutions would be desperately unprepared for it. And I sometimes wonder which is most likely, changing our institutions to support a longer life quickly, or coming up with a breakthrough that leads to a dramatic radical extension in lifespan. I used to think that the second, the lifespan radical life expansion, was less likely, but I'm not so sure as I see the speed at which society adjusts.
So rather than just putting people on the news when they're the oldest person alive, I think the oldest man alive is in the UK these days, we should be celebrating people in their 90s when they are remarkably fit and disease-free.
Yeah.
And say this is possible, especially when they come in family groups around the world.
Yeah. No, we do need to change a more positive mindset. But I think what's interesting is some evidence suggests that the more older people there are, the more negative society is about older people. And I think that's a really interesting connection. It is striking that the more likely the young are to become old, the more we have negative implications about old people, which is a fundamental disconnect. Because if we underestimate the capacity of older people, if we underestimate the capacity of our own later years, we then underinvest in it, and therefore we get the very bad outcomes that we fear. That's a really deep-seated problem. It goes back to this thing, we've got a system that's great at slowing down the dying process, but not the aging process. And so whereas previously a minority got to be old but were pretty active, now we're seeing a majority getting old and not all of them are active. Although I think society is wrong and behind the times, it's got a valid fear. Just pursuing the current model of life extension based around our current health system is not a good way to proceed, which of course then just speaks for what we're talking about, changing how we age.
Towards the end of your book, you quote the poem, The Road Less Travelled, and you suggest that people ought to move away from the default trajectory on which society has set us. Maybe I'm misremembering exactly what you wrote there. What is the advice you give to people who are chugging along the life on their current trajectory? If they're interested in having a healthier aging ahead, what are the things they should be putting attention to?
Actually, I mentioned Robert Frost and that famous quote of his, but Robert Frost, at the end of his life, just said, I'll tell you what I've learned about life. It goes on. I thought that was a nice way to end a book about longevity, because it just goes on for longer now. And there was something about the humanity of Frost and what he saw and all the shocks that happened in his life. I mean, a lot of his children died, his wife died early, but that notion of life goes on, but it's about people and humanity, I thought was really great. But in terms of the road less traveled, I should have picked up that metaphor another way, shouldn't I? Because we do have to live our lives differently. At 58, I have to behave differently from my father at 58, because I have the expectation of more years ahead. And if we're going to change how we age, some of that is about geroscience, but it's about something more fundamental, which is you have to behave differently from past generations your age. And we're looking for breakthroughs in geroscience to change how we age. But you can do all sorts of things with your relationships, your skills, your finances, and you can change how you age in that way. And it's very simple, the economics of dealing with a longer life. You've got more time ahead of you. You need to think about your future more and invest in it more. When you've only got 3 years left of life, say at 58, you don't want to be too forward thinking. When you've got 30, 40 years, you really do need to be forward thinking. And some of that is about investment. And of course, the obvious stuff is finances, but I think that's a mistake to focus just on that. It's about your human capital. It's about your skills. It's about your relationships, your health. And it's about giving yourself options. I think that's the other key thing. The value of an option increases with the uncertainty of the world and the length over which you can hold that option. And the dangers of chronological age, I think, is twofold. The first is it's backward looking, whereas I think the really key issue about longevity is how much more time we've got ahead of us compared to past generations, which changes how we behave. And then how we age is malleable. And again, chronological age is not malleable. It marches forward inexorably 12 months every 12 months.
David asked what advice you have for people who are wanting to age better. Because the real problem is all the people who are not thinking about it, how to get them to be thinking about it. And I suspect the answer is they won't start thinking about it until medical science makes it really clear that we're all going to live quite a lot longer. And then we'll get this rude awakening on the Oprah Winfrey Show or something else, and we'll have the bump.
I'm slightly more optimistic than that. Perhaps as a social scientist, I think people are changing. They are changing how they age already. I'm a patient optimist, is how I describe myself, and the world is sorely testing my patient optimism at the moment. These cultural norms do not change quickly, but if you look at the 20th century, we did change behaviours. We invented teenagers, we invented pensioners, we invented middle age, we created the weekend, we created a 3-stage life. It took a while. These social norms evolved slowly, but during that period you start to see innovation, you start to see experimentation, and I think we have seen some change, not at the pace that we might want, and I still think the mindset is the big challenge. Lots of things have an S-curve, it's just the scale of the S-curve that is the issue here. But I do think there is some behavioural changes happening. And again, I want to come back to the historical context here. I think this is a profound change of humanity. If you think about this changing how we age, and it's in the Nature Aging paper with Martin and David, when infant disease is the main cause of health problems, we rightly target infant mortality, which is like a bump in incidence in early years. As you make progress, that bump disappears and more people live for longer, which means you're less interested in infant mortality and you're more interested in midlife mortality, where there's another bump in terms of incidence in middle ages from those diseases. And as we make progress there, as we flatten that bump, people move on. And so you start to see these aging-related diseases. Of course, they're the diseases where they rise with age and you're likely to getting it. As we make progress in aging better, we're going to be kind of pushing that slope into the future, which means it's always ahead of us. And I think that's really interesting because what it means is that as we get better at aging, we're going to want to age even better more. Whereas when we got better at infant mortality, we weren't interested in infant mortality anymore. So I think this is a really, really profound change because if we can get to our 100s being healthy, we want to reach 100. And if we get to 100 being healthy, let's bring on 110. A bit like the classic economist, no numbers, no dates, but we're in this second era for longevity. We're going to change how we age. And I think that has very profound consequences for our futures as humans, because changing how we age is a different thing from getting the majority to go from being young to being old. And it opens up this possibility of profound change in human lifespan and what we do and behave at every age. It's a race, I say in the book, between human biology and human ingenuity. I personally have no idea which one will win. Everyone has different bets here. But I do think human ingenuity will grow faster relative to its base than human biology. So the gap will get closer and closer for sure.
Especially if more people remain productive longer in lives, if they can keep on working on their favourite subject for longer.
Exactly.
My last question would be advice not for the general public, but imagine there's an election, hypothetically, sometime soon, and there's a new health minister somewhere in the world who calls you in and says he's in a bit of a crisis, he's got a health service in chaos, he's got a few minutes to talk to you. What would your advice be?
That's happening more and more, isn't it? Because the health systems are in crisis everywhere. As a macroeconomist with some experience with central banks and ministries of finance, I'm trying to think, what are the answers that this way of thinking that we've been talking about can bring to the problems they currently have? So I want to try and reframe the debate around longevity so people are more open-minded. It's also saying, well, what are the problems you've currently got? And the one I think is really key is there's no economic growth. There's little productivity growth right now, despite the talk about AI. GDP growth is coming about because of employment growth. Employment growth is happening mainly because of older people. So how do you keep older people in work for longer? And the really key area, 50 to 65. Changing the state pension age doesn't do a great deal when most people aren't working at the state pension age. At 50, about 80% of people are working. By 65, it's down to about a third. How do you stop that tail off? And that's about preventative health. Ultimately, that's about aging better. But I think right now it's about how do I stop people falling ill between 50 and 65? And there's a raft of preventative measures that can do that. Quite simple, basic stuff that we know work, like lowering cholesterol, lowering blood pressure. I mentioned obesity drugs as well. They absolutely have a double dividend. They give you health and they boost the economy. I think the problems are then how you roll them out, because if you've got a health system that's based around intervention, it won't do prevention well. And when it fails on prevention, it will grab the resources for intervention. So I think you've got to find ways of doing the prevention possibly outside of the current health system.
Well, Andrew, as a mere whippersnapper, you've obviously got a lot more books left in you. Congratulations on this one, and we look forward to interviewing you again when you come out with the next one.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for joining us on the London Futurists podcast.